This plane can't take off. A little girl said it to the pilots. They laughed. She was 14. No uniform. No license. Just her dead mother's research and her dead father's crash report memorized word by word. Then the maintenance crew found the fracture. The cockpit fell silent. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was a Saturday morning. June 18, 2022. Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The airport was loud and full of energy before 9 in the morning. Families moved through the long terminals with overstuffed bags and small children who were already wide awake and running. There were kids wearing Mickey Mouse ears on their heads before they had even left the state of Illinois. There were parents carrying cups of expensive airport coffee and looking exhausted in that particular way that people look exhausted before a long trip has even properly begun. Gate C-14 was packed. United Airlines Flight 2247 was boarding for Orlando International Airport. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-800. 168 passengers. 6 crew members. Departure at 9:15 in the morning. The summer sun was already bright outside the terminal windows. School had just ended for the year. Half the people on this flight were families heading to Disney World. The excitement was real and it was loud and it filled the gate area from one end to the other. Riley Carter sat in seat 16A. Window seat. Left side of the aircraft. Row 16. She was 14 years old. She had brown hair that she had pulled back into a simple ponytail that morning without much thought. She had green eyes. She wore wire-rimmed glasses that were slightly too big for her face. The left arm of the glasses had a small piece of tape on it, holding a joint together that had cracked months ago. The glasses had belonged to her aunt before Riley, and even though they were adjusted as best they could be, they still sat slightly crooked on her nose. She wore a plain white t-shirt and dark jeans and old gray Converse sneakers that were worn down at the heels. On the collar of her jacket was a very small silver pin shaped like an airplane in flight. It was simple and small and she wore it every single day. It was the only piece of jewelry she ever put on. Her father had given it to her when she was 9 years old, on a birthday. He had bought it at a small gift shop near the airport where he worked. She remembered that day clearly. She remembered most things clearly. In the seat beside her, seat 16B, sat her Aunt Susan Blake. Susan was 43 years old. She was a teacher at an elementary school in Denver, Colorado. She had a warm face and tired eyes that had bags under them this particular morning because she had been up since 4 o'clock to make the early connection flight that brought them to O'Hare. Her coffee cup was already empty. She had set it in the seat back pocket in front of her with the sad look of someone who knows the coffee is gone and is not sure where the next one is coming from. She was reading a paperback romance novel she had bought at a bookstore inside the airport terminal, the kind of book with a bright cover and a man with good hair. She had gotten 40 pages in and she could already tell how it was going to end, but she was going to read it anyway because that was the point of that kind of book. Susan loved Riley the way family loves family when family is all you have left. She had taken Riley in 2 years ago without hesitating for a single day. She had rearranged her apartment and her routines and her life, and she had done it without complaint because there was nothing to complain about. Riley needed someone. Susan was there. It was simple. Susan understood exactly nothing about aerospace engineering. But she understood grief and she understood what a 14-year-old girl who had lost both of her parents in the space of 18 months actually needed from the people around her. She understood that sometimes what a person needs is just for someone to be present. She understood patience in a deep and practiced way. Riley had a small backpack tucked under the seat in front of her. Inside it she kept 2 things that she considered important. The first was a notebook. It had a blue cover that was soft and worn from being carried everywhere for 2 years. It was completely filled from the very first page to the very last one with her own handwriting. She wrote in small, neat letters. The notebook contained technical notes and hand-drawn diagrams and equations she had carefully copied from textbooks and research papers she had read. Most of those research papers had belonged to her mother. Riley had read every single one of them. She had read some of them 4 and 5 times. The margins of every page in the notebook were dense with her own follow-up questions and her own observations, written smaller to fit into the available space. The second thing she kept in the backpack was a photograph. It lived tucked inside the back cover of the notebook, pressed flat so it would not bend. The photograph showed her parents. Both of them were smiling in the wide, easy way that people smile when they are genuinely happy and not thinking about how they look. They were standing on an airport tarmac somewhere sunny. Her father was wearing his United Airlines captain's uniform. Her mother was holding a rolled-up blueprint under one arm and wearing a Johns Hopkins University sweatshirt. Riley was standing between them in the photograph, maybe 8 years old at the time, laughing at something that nobody in the photograph could remember anymore. Riley looked at that photograph sometimes when she needed to. She did not need to look at it today. Today she was watching the engine outside the window. Riley's father was Captain Daniel Carter. He had flown for United Airlines for 21 years and was based out of Chicago. He was rated for the 747 and the 737. He had accumulated 16,000 flight hours over the course of his career. He was the kind of pilot other pilots respected, not for anything dramatic, but for being steady and careful and good at his job every single day. When Riley was young, before she was old enough to go to school, he would take her to the airport on his days off. Not to fly. Just to sit by the windows and watch the aircraft come and go. He had a lot of patience for her questions, which were many even then. He would explain things to her in simple language without ever making her feel like the explanations were too simple. He told her which aircraft was which just by looking at the shape. He told her what the different sounds meant during different phases of flight. He explained why the flaps moved a certain way when a plane came in for landing and why they moved differently when it was taking off. He showed her how to read a flight path just by watching the angle of the aircraft as it descended. Riley absorbed all of it. Her brain worked that way. It held on to information and organized it and kept it available. Her father had seen this in her early and he had fed it. Her mother was Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She had studied aerospace structural engineering at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. After graduating she had gone to work for a firm in Chicago that did certification work under contract for the Federal Aviation Administration. Her job was to analyze the structural integrity of aircraft and aircraft components and to find the small problems before they could grow into large ones. This kind of work required a specific combination of deep technical knowledge and careful, patient attention. Dr. Mitchell had both. She was very good at her job. Sometimes she brought work home. On those evenings she would spread blueprints and technical documents across the kitchen table and work there while Riley did homework on the other side of the same table. They would sit together in the comfortable way of two people who were used to each other's presence without needing to constantly talk. Riley would ask questions when something caught her eye. Her mother would answer them without looking up from what she was working on, and the answers were real answers, not simplified versions. She never talked down to Riley. She never told her daughter that something was too complicated for her age. One particular evening, when Riley was about 10 years old, her mother looked up from a stress analysis report she had been working on and said, as if she had been thinking about it for a while, that Riley was going to understand all of this someday. Riley had looked up from her homework and said that she understood it now. Her mother had set down her pen and looked at her. Really looked at her, the way adults look at children when the child has said something that moves the conversation into different territory. Then she had smiled. She said yes. She thought Riley did. She was not being polite. She meant it. 2 years before the morning of this flight, in June of 2020, Captain Daniel Carter was on a routine United Airlines flight from Chicago to Denver. It was a 737-800. The passengers had boarded. The aircraft had taken off normally. During the climb out after takeoff, the right engine experienced a structural failure. The failure was caused by a very specific type of problem. A resonance frequency had built up inside the turbine casing of the engine over time, under a combination of conditions that were specific enough that they did not occur on every flight. The right temperature. The right engine speed. The right combination of vibration in the airframe. When those conditions came together, they created what is called harmonic structural resonance. The vibration resonated at just the right frequency to accelerate the growth of tiny cracks in the metal of the turbine casing. Those cracks were called microfractures. They were too small to see and too small to detect through standard visual inspection. But they were real and they were growing. The National Transportation Safety Board investigated the accident for 14 months. The final report ran to several hundred pages. Riley had read all of them. The report used a specific term to describe the mechanism of failure. Harmonic structural resonance. A low-frequency vibration pattern consistent with microfracture growth in the turbine casing, detectable during ground operations if specifically monitored. Detectable. If specifically monitored. Nobody had monitored it. Captain Daniel Carter died. The first officer survived. 3 passengers were seriously injured. Others had minor injuries. Riley was 12 years old. 6 months after her father's accident, Riley's mother was diagnosed with cancer. It was an aggressive type. It moved fast. The doctors told her she had about 8 months. Dr. Sarah Mitchell received this information the way she received most difficult information in her life. She thought about it carefully. She decided what she was going to do with the time she had. She was precise and deliberate about it. Every evening after her treatment, she would sit at the kitchen table with Riley. She spread her research papers out the way she always had. She walked Riley through the material that she considered most important for her daughter to understand. Structural resonance. Harmonic frequency and what it meant inside an engine. The way microfractures developed over time and what they sounded like when they had reached a certain stage. The specific acoustic signatures that could be heard and felt during ground operations before an aircraft took off, if you knew exactly what to listen for. She explained how to estimate frequency ranges without instruments, using what your body could feel and what your ears could hear. She taught Riley the specific indicators that her own research had documented over years of work. Riley asked once, during one of these evenings, why they were going over this particular material so specifically. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said that Riley's father's accident had been detectable. That someone with the right knowledge, in the right place, listening for the right things during ground operations, could have detected that problem before the aircraft took off. She said she wanted Riley to have that knowledge. Riley asked why her specifically. Her mother said because Riley would remember. And because someday it might matter. Dr. Sarah Mitchell died 8 months after her diagnosis. Riley was 13 years old. She moved to Denver, Colorado, to live with her Aunt Susan. She packed her notebook. She packed the photograph. She carried everything her mother had given her. In seat 16B, Susan had spent the entire boarding process watching Riley with the specific kind of careful attention that people who love someone and are worried about them use without knowing they are using it. She had watched Riley settle into the window seat and immediately turn to look at the engine outside. She had seen something like this before on flights. Riley got quiet near aircraft. She paid attention to things that other people did not notice. She had never known what to make of it and had long since decided that she did not need to make anything of it. It was part of Riley. So was the notebook and the photograph and the silver pin on the jacket collar. Susan had learned to be alongside these things without needing to understand them completely. She had tried once, in the first month after Riley moved in, to look up some of the terminology Riley used. Harmonic resonance. Turbine casing stress analysis. Acoustic frequency signatures. She had read the search results and understood almost nothing. She had closed the laptop and decided that what mattered was not whether she understood it but whether Riley was okay. She checked on that every day. She always would. This flight to Orlando, on this Saturday morning in June, was the first time Riley had been on an aircraft since her father died. Aunt Susan had offered to drive 17 hours by car from Denver to Orlando. Riley had said no. She needed to do this. She had said it simply and clearly, and Susan had not pushed back. Riley was not entirely sure what she meant by needing to do it. She just knew that she needed to be on an aircraft again. She needed to sit by the window and watch the engines. She needed to not be afraid of this thing that had been so central to her entire life. Or she needed to be afraid and do it anyway. She understood that those were two different things, and she had thought about the difference. She had been okay during boarding. She had found her seat and put her backpack under the seat in front of her and looked out the window and been okay. She had been okay during pushback. When the aircraft moved slowly away from the gate and the terminal slid sideways across her view, she had kept her breathing even and her hands still, and she had been okay. Then the engine spooled up for taxi and she heard something. It was not a loud sound. It was not something that jumped out at her. A person could have been sitting in row 16 and felt nothing unusual at all. The sound was a frequency that existed underneath all the normal engine noise. It was low and subtle. A vibration that had a slightly wrong quality to it, something almost imperceptible that sat in the background of everything else and pulsed there quietly. Most of the 168 people on that aircraft would have felt nothing. Some might have felt something faintly in their chest without knowing what it was or why. Riley felt it in her chest and she recognized it immediately. She had spent 2 years with her mother's research papers. She had the frequency ranges memorized the way other kids memorized song lyrics. She had read her father's NTSB accident report enough times to know what that specific vibration pattern meant in a specific engine type. She turned her head and looked at the engine outside her window. Right engine. CFM 56-7B. Standard power plant for this aircraft type. She was certain the vibration was coming from there. She opened her notebook to the first blank page she could find. She wrote down the time, 9:11 in the morning. She wrote down what she was hearing and what she was feeling. She estimated the frequency range as accurately as she could without any instruments, using the knowledge her mother had given her. She wrote down what her mother's research said about that specific range. Then she read what she had written. She sat with it for a moment. She looked out the window again. The aircraft was taxiing toward the runway. She turned to her aunt. She said, in a calm and quiet voice, that something was wrong with the right engine. Susan looked up from her novel. She asked Riley what she meant. Riley looked at her aunt directly. She said, "This plane can't take off." Susan stared at her. Riley said it again, quietly and clearly. "This plane can't take off. Not like this. Not with that sound coming from the right engine." She explained. She said the vibration she could hear and feel was in a frequency range that indicated a possible harmonic resonance condition in the turbine casing. She said her mother's 2018 research paper had documented that exact frequency range as a pre-failure indicator. She said it was the same frequency range that had been described in her father's NTSB accident report. Susan looked out the window at the engine. She saw an engine attached to a wing. It looked like an engine. It did not look broken. It looked the same as any engine she had ever seen on any flight she had ever taken. She started to say Riley's name in the gentle, careful tone of someone who loves you and is not sure how to help you. Riley stopped her. She said, clearly and steadily, that she was not scared. She said she was not imagining anything. She said she knew the difference between what anxiety sounded like inside her own head and what she was actually hearing with her actual ears right now. She said this was not fear. This was a real sound. She asked Susan please to call the flight attendant. A flight attendant named James came down the aisle with a warm and professional expression. He had been with United for 9 years and he had a practiced ability to handle passengers in all kinds of states. Susan explained the situation quietly. She was apologetic about it, which was natural. She said her niece thought she heard something with the engine and that Riley had been through a difficult time and that her father had been a pilot who. She did not finish the sentence because she was not sure how to finish it. Riley did not wait. She looked at James directly and spoke without anger and without drama. She said she could hear a harmonic resonance frequency in the right engine turbine casing. She said the frequency was in the approximately 40 to 60 Hz range. She said her mother had been an aerospace structural engineer named Dr. Sarah Mitchell who had published research specifically on that frequency range as a pre-failure indicator in CFM 56 series engines. She said her father, Captain Daniel Carter, had died in an accident that the National Transportation Safety Board later attributed to exactly this type of resonance going undetected. James looked at her. He took in what she looked like. 14 years old. Wire-rimmed glasses with tape on one arm. Brown hair in a ponytail. Explaining turbine resonance frequencies with complete composure, as if this were a normal conversation to be having. He looked at Susan. Susan gave him the helpless look of a person who genuinely could not tell in this moment whether her niece was having an anxiety response or telling the truth, and who was deeply aware of how much it mattered which one it was. James said he would let the captain know and that he appreciated her telling him. He walked forward toward the cockpit. He was professional about it. His face was neutral. But he walked. Up in the cockpit, Captain Robert Haynes was running through the final items on his pre-takeoff checklist. He was 51 years old. He had 19,000 hours of flight time logged over a career that had begun in the Air Force and moved to commercial aviation. He had seen and heard a great many things. First Officer Kate Morrison was 33 years old with 6,200 hours. She was on the radio handling the back and forth with O'Hare ground control as the aircraft progressed toward the runway. James knocked on the cockpit door and entered. He explained what the girl in seat 16A had said. A 14-year-old passenger. She believed she could hear a resonance frequency in the right engine. Her father had been a United Airlines pilot who had died in an accident. Her mother had done research on engine acoustics. Captain Haynes looked up from his checklist. His expression was the expression of an experienced professional who has been in this industry long enough to have received a wide variety of passenger concerns and who has learned to evaluate them quickly. He said the engine instruments were all green. He said the pre-flight checks had been completed properly and that the maintenance team had signed off on the aircraft earlier that morning. He said it as a statement, not a question. James said he understood and that the girl had been quite specific. He tried to convey the specificity of what she had said. The report number. The engineering terms. Haynes looked at him for a moment. Then he said, plainly, a 14-year-old. It was not said unkindly. It was said as a fact being placed on a scale and found to be light. James nodded. Captain Haynes looked across the cockpit at First Officer Morrison. Something passed between them in the quiet way that things pass between people who have worked together long enough to communicate without speaking. Not cruelty. Not malice. Just the familiar recognition that passengers sometimes hear things and those things are sometimes the result of fear or inexperience or the imagination working hard in a stressful environment. Haynes gave a small smile. He told James to go back and tell her they appreciated her concern and that all systems were showing normal. James nodded. He left. In the cockpit, with the door closed, Kate Morrison said quietly, just between the two of them, kids and engines. Captain Haynes shook his head slightly. They both laughed. It was small. It lasted 2 seconds. It was private, the kind of thing that stays between two colleagues and goes no further. Then they went back to their work. James came back to row 16 and crouched beside Riley's seat. He had kind eyes and he used them now. He told her the captain had checked and that all systems were showing normal. He said the instruments were green and that maintenance had completed its checks that morning and that everything was fine. He said she was safe and she could relax. Riley looked at him. She did not look relieved. She asked him if he had told the captain the specific frequency range she had described. James said he had mentioned what she said, yes. Riley asked if the captain had responded specifically to the 40 to 60 Hz range. James paused. He said the captain had said the instruments were green. Riley absorbed that answer. Then she turned back to the window. She looked at the engine. She looked at her notebook and the page of notes she had written. She looked at the photograph in the back cover of the notebook. Her father in his uniform on a tarmac. Her mother holding a blueprint. She 8 years old and laughing between them. She looked at the engine again. The aircraft was approaching the runway threshold. They were nearly in position for takeoff. She unbuckled her seatbelt. Susan grabbed her arm. Her grip was firm and her face was worried. Riley looked at her aunt and said, quietly and very clearly, that she was not going to sit here. She said her father had died because nobody checked. She said her mother had spent her last 8 months on Earth teaching her exactly what to check for and how to detect it. She said she was not going to sit in this seat and do nothing while the same thing happened again. Then she stood up and moved into the aisle. Her back was straight. Her face was calm. Her hands were shaking slightly inside the pockets of her jacket and she was aware of this and she did not take her hands out of her pockets. James appeared immediately and stepped toward her and said, with firm kindness, that she could not be in the aisle and needed to return to her seat. Riley stopped and looked at him and began to speak. She said her name was Riley Carter. She said her father was Captain Daniel Carter of United Airlines, based in Chicago, deceased June 14, 2020. She said the NTSB accident report number was DCA-20FA-158. She said the cause of the accident, as determined after a 14-month investigation, was harmonic structural resonance in the right engine turbine casing, in the frequency range of 40 to 60 Hz, undetected during pre-flight operations because nobody was acoustically monitoring for it. She said the report had stated, and she said this part slowly and carefully so that each word landed separately, detectable during ground operations if specifically monitored. She looked at James and said that they were still in ground operations right now. She said the aircraft had not yet taken off. She asked him, please, to let her speak to the captain directly. James stared at her. This was not a situation that 9 years with United Airlines had prepared him for in any specific way. A 14-year-old girl standing in the aisle of an aircraft at the runway threshold, quoting an NTSB accident report number from memory, her hands hidden in her jacket pockets, her voice completely steady, her eyes completely serious. He picked up the interphone. In the cockpit, Captain Haynes heard the NTSB report number. He heard it clearly. He set down what he was holding. He looked at First Officer Morrison. Something in his expression had changed. It was subtle but it was there. He said, in a different tone than before, send her up. Riley stood in the cockpit doorway. The space was small and the instruments were everywhere and there were 2 experienced pilots looking at her. Captain Haynes turned in his seat to face her. He looked at her for a moment. Then he acknowledged it. He said that she knew her father's accident report number. Riley said she knew every page of the report, including Appendix C, which contained the complete frequency analysis that had been submitted to the NTSB by the Boeing engineering team and by the independent consultants. She said her mother was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an aerospace structural engineer who had done her doctoral work on structural resonance in turbine components, and that in the 8 months before she died she had sat with Riley every evening and taught her everything she knew about how to detect this specific problem acoustically during ground operations. Captain Haynes was quiet. He said their instruments were showing normal readings. But he said it differently than the first time. The first time it had been a statement that closed a door. Now it sounded like a question looking for an answer. Riley said that instruments did not always catch early-stage harmonic resonance. She said her mother's 2018 paper, published in the Journal of Aerospace Engineering, had documented 17 separate cases where cockpit instruments showed entirely normal readings during the early stage of resonance buildup in CFM56 series engine turbine casings. The detection required acoustic monitoring, not instrument monitoring. Specifically acoustic. First Officer Kate Morrison turned fully around in her seat and looked at Riley. She asked Riley to confirm the frequency range. Riley said 40 to 60 Hz. Morrison said that range fell below the standard instrument sensitivity threshold on this aircraft type. Riley said yes. That was precisely what her mother's paper had documented. Standard instruments would not register it. But it was audible and detectable through the body if you knew what to listen for and how to interpret what you were hearing. Kate Morrison looked at Robert Haynes. He looked at the runway ahead of them through the cockpit windshield. Clear morning sky. The runway was empty. Takeoff clearance from O'Hare ground had come through 30 seconds ago. He had not acknowledged it. He sat for a moment. Then he made a decision and reached for the radio. He said, O'Hare ground, United 2247. We are holding at the runway threshold. Requesting return to gate C14 for a precautionary maintenance check, right engine. The controller's response came back quickly. There was a professional surprise in the voice. The controller asked if there was a declared emergency. Haynes said no. He said it was precautionary. He said they were returning to the gate. He released the radio and turned to Riley. He told her to go back to her seat. She said okay and turned. Then he said her name. She stopped with her back to him and turned around. He asked her, directly, what specifically the maintenance team should listen for when they arrived at the aircraft. She turned fully back to face the cockpit and she told him. She gave him the frequency range. She described the location on the right engine casing where the resonance would be most audible if it was present. She told him what acoustic equipment to use if the maintenance team had it available, and she told him what a trained technician could feel manually at that location if equipment was not on hand. Captain Haynes wrote it down as she spoke. Word by word. The aircraft turned away from the runway threshold and taxied back toward the gate. Inside the cabin, 168 passengers shifted in their seats and looked at each other and looked at their phones. The captain's voice came over the intercom with an announcement. Precautionary maintenance check. We apologize for the inconvenience. There was confused murmuring. There was the specific kind of frustration that builds quickly in an airplane cabin when a plan changes and nobody has explained why. People checked connecting flight times. A man in row 12 said something under his breath. The family in row 8 with the 3 children and the Disney ears looked, for a moment, like the trip was already over before it had started. The youngest child, who might have been 5, started to cry quietly. The parents looked at each other with the exhausted look of parents who have been managing a big trip all morning and are now facing a new problem. Susan held Riley's hand. She said nothing. She just held her hand. Riley sat very still and watched out the window as the aircraft docked at the gate and the maintenance crew arrived. Riley watched the crew set up. She watched Pete Dawson, though she did not know his name yet, position equipment beside the right engine. She watched him put on headphones connected to an acoustic monitoring device. She watched the crew work with the focused efficiency of people who do a specific technical job very well. 15 minutes passed. Then she saw something change in Pete Dawson's body. He was crouched near the engine casing. Then he stood up. He took the headphones off. He looked at the technician standing beside him and said something Riley could not hear through the aircraft window. The other technician's face changed. Not in a dramatic way. In the way a face changes when it receives information that is serious and unexpected. Pete Dawson reached for the radio on his belt. They had found a microfracture in the right engine turbine casing. It was in the early stage of development. It was not yet at the critical threshold. It had not yet reached the size where standard protocols would require immediate grounding. But it was real. It was present. It was consistent with harmonic resonance buildup. It was in the exact frequency range that Riley had described to the captain. It was in the exact location on the engine casing that she had specified. Pete Dawson would later write in his maintenance report that the fracture was not visible during any standard visual inspection process. He wrote that the acoustic detection approach, using the frequency range that had been provided to the maintenance team by the passenger, had identified the precise location of the fracture. He wrote that without acoustic monitoring specifically targeting that frequency range, this fracture would not have been found during normal pre-flight procedures. He wrote that carefully, and he chose each word carefully because he understood what he was writing about. Captain Robert Haynes was standing at the front of the cabin when the radio message from Pete Dawson came through. He listened to Pete's voice describe what the team had found. The location of the fracture. The frequency match with what the passenger had described. The severity assessment. Early stage. Real. Confirmed. He stood still for a moment. The cabin was full of passengers who were frustrated and confused and who were trying to understand what was happening. He looked down the aisle toward row 16. Riley was sitting quietly in her window seat, watching the maintenance crew through the glass. He walked down the aisle. Passengers noticed a captain moving through a cabin. They looked up. A few people watched him walk. He reached row 16 and stopped. Riley looked up at him. He crouched down so that he was at eye level with her, and he spoke quietly, so that the conversation stayed between them. He told her they had found it. Microfracture. Right engine casing. Exactly where she had said it would be. Riley looked at him. She did not say anything at first. She did not say "I told you so." She did not say "I knew it." Her eyes filled with tears, slowly, and she held them there and did not let them fall. Captain Haynes said, quietly, that there was something he needed to tell her. He said that when James had first come to the cockpit and told them about her, he and First Officer Morrison had laughed. "Small," he said. "Private. Between us. But we laughed." He said it plainly because he thought she deserved to hear it plainly. He said he was sorry. Riley was quiet. Then she said she knew. She said she had known at the time. Then she said that her father's accident report had said the problem was detectable. She said she had just wanted someone to detect it. Captain Haynes looked at this 14-year-old girl sitting in seat 16A. He thought about what her mother had done with the last months of her life. He thought about what it had taken for Riley to stand up and walk forward in a taxiing aircraft when two adults had already smiled and turned away. He stood up. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Then he walked back to the cockpit. First Officer Morrison was coordinating the maintenance hold on the radio. She looked at him when he came in and sat down. He said 2 words. It was real. Kate Morrison did not respond for a long moment. Then she asked how old Riley was. He said 14. Morrison turned back to the radio. She did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say, and they both knew it. Susan had been holding herself together for the last 40 minutes. She had held herself together when Riley stood up in the aisle of a taxiing aircraft, and she had not tried to pull her back by force. She had held herself together through the return to the gate and through the waiting and through the maintenance crew arriving and through all of it. When she watched Captain Haynes crouch down beside Riley and speak quietly to her, she could not hear the words, but she could see Riley's face through the conversation. She could see what was happening on that face. She stopped holding herself together then. She put her arm around Riley. Riley leaned into her, just slightly, the way a person leans when they need something solid beside them but do not want to make a production of needing it. They sat like that for a while. Then Riley said something quietly. She said she thought her mom would have liked knowing it worked. Susan pressed her lips together very hard. She nodded. She said yeah, Bug. She said her mom definitely would have liked that. Word traveled through the gate area the way words travel when 168 people are sitting in an airport terminal with nothing to do except wait and talk. The delay was real and the frustration was real, and people were checking connecting flights and calculating hotel costs in their heads. But the story spread. A 14-year-old girl had been in seat 16A. Her father was a United Airlines captain who had died in an engine accident. Her mother was an aerospace engineer. Before she died, the mother had spent months teaching her daughter what to look for. The girl had heard something during taxi. She had reported it. The flight attendant had told the captain. The captain had laughed. The girl had stood up anyway. She had walked forward on a taxiing aircraft. She had quoted the accident report number of her father's crash from memory. And they had found a fracture in exactly the location she had described. The gate area was quiet in a different way than it had been before. Not the quiet of boredom. Something heavier than that. The kind of quiet that comes when people understand that something serious nearly happened and that it did not happen because of one person who did not sit down. The delay lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes in total. United Airlines arranged a replacement aircraft. The airline provided meal vouchers to all passengers. They arranged accommodations for passengers who had missed their connecting flights. Most people were frustrated, and that was fair and understandable. Long waits in airports are genuinely difficult, particularly for families with young children and carefully made plans. But the family from row 8, the one with the 3 children and the Disney ears, had heard the full story from another passenger while they sat in the gate area waiting. The mother of that family, after she heard what had happened, walked across the gate area to where Riley was sitting with her aunt. She sat down in a chair beside Riley and looked at her for a moment before she spoke. She said simply, and without drama, that her children had been going to be on that plane. She said thank you. Then she got up and went back to her family. Her oldest child, a kid who looked about 10, had been watching the whole thing from across the gate. Riley looked at him. He gave her a small nod. Just that. Just a nod. Riley gave one back. The FAA was notified within hours of the maintenance finding. The specific engine, logged by its serial number, was immediately pulled from service. The fracture was documented with photographs and measurements and put through a full structural analysis. Pete Dawson's maintenance report was filed and became part of the official record. During the preliminary FAA review that followed, Dr. Sarah Mitchell's 2018 paper was referenced directly. The specific section that was cited was the one on acoustic detection methodology for subthreshold frequency resonance in CFM56 series turbine casings. That paper had been published 4 years earlier. In 4 years it had accumulated 23 citations in academic and technical literature. It had been reviewed and discussed in research circles. But it had never been incorporated into United Airlines maintenance protocols. It had never become part of the standard process for checking this type of engine. That was going to change. 3 days after the flight, Captain Robert Haynes sat before the United Airlines Internal Review Board and gave a formal statement. He spoke about the pre-flight process. He spoke about the escalation path from passenger to flight attendant to cockpit. He spoke about what had happened and in what sequence. Near the end of his statement he set aside the procedural language. He said that when James had come to the cockpit and told him about the girl in 16A, he had dismissed it immediately. He said he had assumed anxiety. He had heard 14-year-old girl and he had assumed that what he was dealing with was a young person who had lost a parent and was frightened of flying and was expressing that fear in technical language. He said he had not actually listened to the content of what she was reporting. He had only responded to his assumption about why she was reporting it. He said that was wrong. He said it was wrong before the fracture was found and it would have been wrong even if nothing had been found. He said a specific technical claim with specific cited evidence and a specific source deserves a specific technical response. Not a patient smile and a gentle dismissal. He said her father had died because a detectable problem was not detected. He said her mother had used her last months alive to make sure her daughter could detect it. And he said that he and First Officer Morrison had almost not allowed her to. He paused for a long moment in the official transcript. Then he continued. He said she was 14 years old. He said she had quoted an NTSB accident report number from memory and described the frequency range and the location and the detection methodology with precision. He said she had then stood up on a taxiing aircraft and walked forward because she had decided she was not going to sit there. He said that in 28 years of aviation he had seen courage in various forms and contexts, and that what Riley Carter had done on that Saturday morning took more of it than most things he had witnessed in all that time. 3 weeks after the flight, First Officer Kate Morrison gave a brief statement to an aviation safety newsletter that had contacted her for comment. She said she had one thing to say and she wanted to say it clearly. She said that she and Captain Haynes had laughed. She said she wanted that to be on the record because it was true and because it mattered. They had heard a 14-year-old think something is wrong with the engine and they had laughed. Small. Private. 2 seconds. Between colleagues. But they had laughed. She said Dr. Sarah Mitchell's 2018 research paper had been added to United Airlines training materials. She said Captain Daniel Carter's NTSB accident report had already been in the training materials. It was used as a case study in acoustic resonance detection failure. She said they had been studying that family's tragedy as a training example during the same period in which they had dismissed the one person who had studied it the most closely of anyone alive. She said she thought about that. Pete Dawson, the lead maintenance technician who found the fracture, gave no public statements. He did not speak to journalists. He did not appear in any of the news coverage that followed. He went back to work. But he printed a copy of Dr. Sarah Mitchell's 2018 research paper and put it in his work locker. He read parts of it sometimes. The abstract was only one paragraph. The last sentence of the abstract said, "The methodology described herein requires no specialized equipment beyond trained human perception. Detection saves lives. The barrier is not capability. The barrier is knowing what to listen for." He had underlined that sentence. In red pen. It stayed underlined. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a space when something that nearly happened is understood clearly for the first time. It is not like the silence of boredom or the silence of peace. It is heavier. It has weight that you feel in your chest. It is the silence of people who are doing the math quietly in their heads and arriving at the same answer and not wanting to say it out loud because saying it out loud makes it more real than they are ready for it to be. That silence fell over different people in different places after the story of Flight 2247 became known. It fell over Captain Haynes in his hotel room the night after the flight, when he lay awake and went through the morning again in his mind, step by step, from the moment James knocked on the cockpit door to the moment he heard Pete Dawson's voice on the radio. It fell over Kate Morrison when she sat at her kitchen table 3 days later and read Dr. Sarah Mitchell's 2018 research paper from beginning to end for the first time. It fell over every maintenance technician at every United Airlines hub when the updated protocols were distributed and they read the new section on acoustic detection methodology and understood where it had come from and why it was being added now and who had made it necessary. The silence had different textures in different places. But it was the same silence. There are things that cannot be taught in a classroom and cannot be earned through years of experience and cannot be given by any institution or credential or title. There is a kind of knowledge that comes from love. From sitting across a kitchen table from someone who loves you and who is running out of time and who is using that time to give you something that might matter someday when you are on your own and they are not there to help you. Riley Carter did not choose to be in seat 16A that morning. She did not choose to have a father who flew 737-800s for United Airlines. She did not choose to have a mother whose entire professional life was devoted to understanding the ways that aircraft could fail and the ways that those failures could be detected before they became catastrophes. She did not choose to lose them both before she was 14 years old. She did not choose any of it. What she chose was to listen. To her father at the airport windows. To her mother at the kitchen table. To the research papers spread across the table in the evenings. to the notebook that accumulated everything and kept it. And then she chose, on a Saturday morning in June on a taxiing aircraft at the runway threshold, to stand up. That was the choice. Everything else had already been given to her by the two people she had lost. The standing up was hers alone. 3 weeks after the flight, an aviation safety journalist obtained Pete Dawson's maintenance report through a Freedom of Information request and published the story. Within 48 hours it was in every major news outlet. The headline in most places was some version of, 14-year-old girl stops takeoff, saves 168 lives using her dead mother's research. United Airlines released a formal statement. The FAA released a statement. Aviation safety organizations around the world contacted the journal that had published Dr. Mitchell's paper requesting copies. The paper received 4,000 new citations in the first 3 weeks after publication. Riley gave no interviews. She did not speak to any journalists. Her Aunt Susan gave one statement on her behalf. Susan said Riley was 14 years old and in 8th grade and had 2 friends and a dog she had named after a planet and was currently learning to skateboard with limited success. She said Riley was a normal kid who had had abnormal things happen to her and who had handled those things in a way that her parents would have recognized. She said Riley's father had taught her to love aircraft. Her mother had taught her to understand them. Riley had done the rest herself. She said Riley did not want to be famous. The only thing Riley had asked Susan to communicate publicly was that she wanted people to read her mother's paper. The citation count passed 11,000 within the month. Riley flew to Orlando on the replacement aircraft later that same day. She asked for window seat 16A on the replacement flight. Her aunt looked at her when she asked. Riley said the same seat, yes. She sat down and buckled her seatbelt and turned to the window. She watched the engine during taxi. This engine sounded right. She knew the difference. She had always known the difference between the sound of an engine working the way it was supposed to work and the sound of an engine that had something wrong with it. But now she had proven, in front of 168 people and a maintenance team and 2 experienced pilots, that she knew. That was something different from just knowing. She kept her notebook open in her lap during the flight. She was not writing anything. The notebook was open to the page from earlier that morning, the page where she had written the time and the frequency estimate and the notes about her mother's research. She looked at that page sometimes and then looked out the window. At cruising altitude, Susan fell asleep in the seat beside her. The sound of Susan breathing steadily in sleep was familiar and comfortable. Riley looked out at the clouds spread below the aircraft like a white floor that went on forever. She thought about her father. The airport trips when she was small. The patient way he explained everything. Which plane was which. What each sound meant. Why things moved the way they moved. She thought about her mother. The kitchen table in the evenings. The blueprints and the research papers spread across it. The small desk lamp making a circle of light over the work. I want you to be able to detect it. Because you'll remember. Because someday it might matter. She had remembered. And it had mattered. Riley closed the notebook. She took the photograph out of the back cover and held it in both hands. Her father in his uniform. Her mother with the blueprint. 8-year-old Riley between them laughing at something nobody could name anymore. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked out the window. Blue sky. Smooth air. The right engine turning clean and even and exactly right. She put the photograph back and closed the notebook and closed her eyes. And for the first time since her father died, on an aircraft in the air, she slept. 1 year after the flight, Riley completed 8th grade and began high school. She entered a national aerospace engineering competition that year. Her project built directly on her mother's 2018 research paper. She had taken the foundational work on acoustic detection methodology for early-stage turbine resonance and extended it. She had incorporated her own observations from the morning at O'Hare. She had added data, refined the detection methodology for different engine configurations, and made the process more specific and more practical for use by working maintenance teams who might not have access to sophisticated equipment. She titled the project, "What to Listen For: Extending Acoustic Detection Methodology in CFM56 Series Turbine Casings." The dedication page, inside the front cover, was handwritten. It said, "For Dad, who taught me what aircraft sound like when they're right. For Mom, who taught me what they sound like when they're not. I was listening." She won first place in the national competition. The judges noted in their written assessment that the project demonstrated a level of technical rigor and practical applicability that was unusual at any level of competition and particularly remarkable from a 15-year-old working with self-taught foundational knowledge. Riley read that assessment once and put it in a drawer. She did not frame it or display it. She did not tell anyone at school about it. The two friends she had, who had known her before any of this happened, asked her about it. She gave them a short answer and changed the subject. They understood. They were her friends for a reason. After the results were announced, she received a handwritten letter from Captain Robert Haynes. It was 3 paragraphs. She read the entire letter twice and then she read the last paragraph again. He wrote that he had laughed and that he was not going to find comfortable language for that fact or pretend it was something other than what it was. He wrote that he had laughed and then listened to her and then discovered that he should have listened first. He wrote that he would not make that mistake again. He said he wanted her to know that. Then, at the end of the letter, he wrote, "From one person who loves aircraft to another." Riley folded the letter carefully along its original folds. She placed it inside her notebook, next to the photograph. Where it stayed,